G'day! Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. Today's special guest is military historian and battlefield guide Paul Reed. And Paul is an expert to do with the World War One and World War Two campaigns. And he has joined us today to talk about the Battle of Amiens on August the 8th in 1918 and how that battle turned the tide for the Allies as they pushed for victory. And for the German army, it was the Black Day, the day in which they lost the war. Hi, Paul. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
No, Paul, I really do appreciate you giving up your time and just telling our listeners a little bit about the infamous Battle of Amiens. And so the Battle of Amiens was a decisive victory that boosted the Allies' morale. And while it raised hopes for the end of the war, many soldiers and their commanders still thought that the war would last for years. What reasons would you give for them thinking that the war could drag on?
Well, I think that if you look at that day, and it was a decisive day, when we look back over more than a century, we know that that was the beginning of the end of the Great War on the Western Front. At the time, commanders would have been pleased with the outcome of that battle and the incredible advances that were made, but the German army was still formidable. The Western Front was 450 miles long, and the German army was occupying all 450 miles of that. The British and Commonwealth sector was about 100 miles of it, and the French were holding the rest and a bit held by the Belgians right at the top. But it was the sheer size and scale of the German army, and I think that commanders realised that it would not be and had not been an easy opponent to beat. That even at this critical moment, which had seen the breaking of the German lines on the Somme, victory wasn't round the corner. It was still going to be a hard slog, and some believed it would continue on into the next year. When you look at the papers of Sir Douglas Haig, the Commander-in-Chief, he really did think the war would continue into 1919, if not 1920. And he worried about that because of the prolonging of the war, but he worried more because of the arrival of the Americans, and that if the war did go into the next year, the Americans would take a bigger and bigger role, and he feared that the achievements and the successes of British and Commonwealth troops within the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, of which they were all a part, would be somehow forgotten, and it would become an American victory, which in many respects, when you look at the next war, 1944-45, that's exactly what happened. You know, the achievements, the Brits and the Canadians in Normandy laid the pathway to victory, and the Americans helped achieve that victory in the latter part of the war. And today, when you travel around Normandy, it's often referred to as the American invasion. So, you know, I think Haig was probably right in that respect. So it was a decisive battle, but you can't win a war in a single day. It's about what you do next, and what they did next was to continue with that pressure to collapse the German army further.
You hear in accounts, Paul, from accounts that have been made, and the German general Erich Ludendorff described the 8th of August was the Black Day of the German army in the history of war. And for him, the battle was the beginning of the end. What aspects about this battle convinced him and many in the German high command that they couldn't win the war and that it was time to end it?
I think that for Ludendorff, the idea of this being the Black Day was that the battle clearly demonstrated that the Allies knew how to fight a war now and win it. That they were fighting a modern war with modern approaches, modern tactics and modern weaponry. And that Germany didn't really stand a chance in this. There are historians who believe that Germany was doomed to lose both world wars because their economy, their industry, cannot cope with a protracted conflict, and that really they needed a lightning war, which in World War II they called a blitzkrieg, to try and end the war swiftly. Now, 8th of August 1918, that's 4 years of war for Germany. And Germany is on its knees as a consequence of this. because of the not just events on the battlefield, but events wider than that. So with the Allied submarine blockade of Germany, Germany is quite literally on its knees. It has to import a huge amount of resources and material and supplies to keep the nation going. And people are starving on the streets of Germany and in the field. I mean, back in the 80s, when I interviewed Great War veterans, the ones that took part in this period of the war, aside from the usual German words of Ja, Nein, and Kamerad, which they'd know, yes, no, and comrade, they would know the German word Fleisch, which is the word for meat. Because when you took a German prisoner at this stage of the war, he'd pop his hands up and he'd say, Kamerad, Fleisch bitte, and he'd be after tins of bully beef. Now, you know, these are soldiers just like the diggers that have been chomping on this stuff since day one of their military service. They're fed up with bully beef. You know, you can have it, mate, keep it. But it shows how desperate the Germans were. You know, they'd had, if you go back 2 years to Pozières, when the Australians were at Pozières in July to September 1916, the Germans that they encountered there were well fed, well supplied. They had all sorts of treats and things that, you know, Allied troops did not have. I mean, I found evidence of this on the battlefield today, little schnapps glasses and little glass jars that have a picture of the Kaiser and the Emperor of Austria on it. And there was mustard in that. And think, you know, I mean, our guys didn't get anything like that. And the Germans had beer and they had fizzy water and, you know, all sorts. But by 1918, they were eating bread made out of sawdust, coffee made from ground acorns, ersatz coffee, meat that, well, we won't, you know, you've not long had your dinner, I've not long had my breakfast, we won't dwell on what was in their meat. They were in a state, and I think that Ludendorff realised that they'd been unable to achieve that victory with the spring offensives on the Somme in Flanders, on the Chemin des Dames and in the Marne. And now they were back to where they'd been at the end of the Schlieffen Plan in 1914, which was stalemate, and that Germany did not have the resources or the continued manpower to be able to continue with that. And as the war went on, beyond Amiens, the age of German combat troops dropped dramatically. They began calling up advanced years of troops. So, you know, your class of whatever year it is the year that you're 18 and going into the German army. So they'd already called up the class of 1918 for 1918, but they began calling up the class of 1919 and then on into 1920. So you've got 16-year-olds being brought into the German army. And this just shows how desperate they were for everything, resources, manpower, the lot.
So in your opinion, Paul, would you say that the Battle of Amiens, would it be fair to say that the German army was a broken army after this battle?
I think it was the beginning of the end of the German army. It demonstrated that the German army wasn't capable of prolonging this war, this static war on the Western Front. It was going to take, as it did, several more months of heavy fighting with heavy losses to be able to completely break it, and proper coalition warfare where every ally was contributing to that, not just British troops, not just Commonwealth troops, but the Americans and most importantly the French. We often forget about the important role that they had, but it signalled this massive turning point. I mean, it's often referred to as the 100 days from the 8th of August to the 11th of November. It's not quite 100 days, but it's a good concept of it being that final phase of the war. And historians like to do this. They like to look back on a period and categorise it. And you can clearly categorise that period from the beginning of the Battle of Amiens to the armistice as the collapse and finish of the German army.
Well, you often read, Paul, and I've read accounts that you see that the Germans, that they were stabbed in the back by the people at home. Do you agree with this, or were they soundly beaten on the battlefield in World War One?
They were soundly beaten. The whole concept of stabbing in the back, of course, is a Hitlerian approach to the history of Germany in that period. And when you jump towards the end of the war, you had men like General Pershing, who commanded the American Expeditionary Force. He was of the view that we should round up the Germans and march them to Berlin in disgrace to make sure that they understood that this was a defeat. we didn't do that. We did it at the end of the Second World War. There's those famous photographs of long lines of German prisoners on the autobahns in 1945. But we didn't do that in 1918. We allowed the Germans to go home. And there's photographs of them coming across the Cologne Bridge in the Rhineland. And these guys are pulling their field guns. They're on their cavalry horses. They got rifles across their chests. And it enabled Hitler to be able to stand up in Bavarian beer killers in the 1920s and say, look, do you not remember, good people of Munich, your brother, your husband, your son returned from the war with his rifle on his chest, his cartridges in his pockets, his grenades on his belt. We were not defeated. We were stabbed in the back by Bolsheviks, traitors, Jews, whatever you want to add to that list. So it created a myth, and a myth that gave traction to really the path to another war.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with what you've said. It definitely, but it's a common perception that is still. If you speak to people in public today, Paul, people still they believe it. They really believe that the Germans were stabbed in the back.
Yeah, that's right. And I think there's a sort of a belief of that in 1940 with 1945 as well. Is it's somehow that we didn't win the war, the Germans sort of lost it because they made mistakes. Well, all armies make mistakes, but the reality is, and there is a parallel between the army of 1918 and the army of 1945 in that they both demonstrate that the Allies had reached a pinnacle of their ability to fight a modern war and win it. And then to describe it in any other way, particularly with 1918, is a mistake in my view, because 1918 was the birth of modern warfare, and the 8th of August was the biggest demonstration of that at that point.
So we probably should get into it, Paul, and actually explain the battle itself. So what were the objectives of Battle of Amiens, and what were the tactics that were being used in the battle?
Well, Amiens is a big city. It's got major rail links. The BEF, which included, of course, the Australian Imperial Force, basically resupplied itself to the southern sector of the front through that route. And in the spring of 1918, the Australians in particular at Villers-Bretonneux had been very, very prominent in stopping the Germans getting to that point to take that railhead. The outcome of the war could have been very different if that had happened. So with the advance outwards from Amiens, it was to push the Germans further back from that, so it didn't give them a time to gather their forces again and potentially launch another attack in the summer to try and take Amiens finally. But it was more than that. It was about pushing the Germans back out of France and winning this war. If you look at the British battles of the war, they are part of a coalition war with the French. And the French, they weren't interested in Flanders and Ypres and Passchendaele. They were interested in kicking the Boche out of mainland France. So they were forever putting us under pressure to continue with this. And Amiens, with General Foch's, Marshal Foch as he was then, is another example of that. And by that stage, the recovery had been made from the shocks of the spring offensives. The British Army had reinforced itself. The Australians had played a prominent role. They'd received reinforcements as well. The same with the Canadians. And the French army was now in a position to participate. So all these elements were coming together so that the battle could be fought. And Amiens was the obvious route because it was ground not smashed to bits by 4 years of war. And it, just as the Germans had experienced in the spring, their advance had been made easier by advancing along a main axis road, which is the old Roman road from Saint-Quentin, Saint-Quentin to Amiens, and we could do the same sort of thing. So it was perfect ground, really, for this type of battle. And when you look back to previous actions, which had sort of set the pace for this, with Monash at the Hamel being one of them, this was a chance to show what that type of warfare could do, but on a much bigger scale. So the idea was to break through on a wide front from a British and Commonwealth perspective. 3 army corps, the British to the north of the River Somme, then the Australian Corps, and then the Canadian Corps, and then where their boundary was on the Montdidier Road, the French were beyond that. And again, they're an important part of this battle. And the troops were assembled as part of the Fourth Army under General Rawlinson, who had been a commander on the Somme in 1916. And the war was a very different war 2 years on. Just up the road was the Chateau at Querrieux, where he had his headquarters. That was too near the front line now to be of any use to him then. But the war had moved on since he'd been dining and resting in those fine quarters. It was a modern war, and men like him enabled that type of warfare to happen. They didn't necessarily lead it. That was down to some of the corps commanders, like Monash. Ivor Maxey would be a British example of that, for example. And then with the Canadians, with Arthur Currie, and prior to him, Julian Byng in the Canadian Corps. So you're seeing a whole development, and commanders, successful commanders, I believe, are ones that are good managers and enable the men beneath them who have the experience, particularly the combat experience necessary, and the ability to learn from that experience, enable them to change the way and approaches that you fight. And by 1918, that's what you're seeing.
It sounds like a very complex plan and battle in a sense.
It was, yeah, and it followed certain lines. I mean, if you look at a map of it, it's got coloured lines on it. It's got the red, blue, and green lines showing the different areas of advances. So they followed a similar pattern, set objectives. But by this stage of the war, and you see this with the Australian Corps, they're using the leapfrogging tactic. In 1916, one Australian division would have been required to advance through Pozieres, take the OG lines and Mouquet Farm, and that's it. And they realised that in doing all that, they're going to sustain heavy losses. And by the time, if they even reach those objectives, they're not going to be in a fit state to beat off German counterattacks. So by 1918, you'll see in Australian divisions, as with British and Canadian ones, certain units take the first objective, the next unit then leapfrogs through them to the next objective, and then another unit leapfrogs through them to the third objective. And that way you've always got freshish troops at the final objective, and then a bulk of troops behind them to support them if when the Germans counterattack. So it's a complex thing, and woven into that is all the different aspects of warfare that they had at their disposal, from the aircraft in the sky, both strafing the Germans, bombing the Germans, resupplying troops on the ground, and the Australians with the Battle of La Hamel. It would see in the first example of that, the RAF coming in at low level and dropping crates of ammunition onto the objective, so that when the men got there, they had ammunition supplies and didn't have to carry 250 rounds with them, which slowed them down. You're seeing Mark V Star tanks being used as the first armoured personnel carriers to move troops up rapidly from, so that you're not bogged down by this whole inability to move men forward at the key moment. And then the integration of tanks and a very detailed and complex artillery plan, but which was flexible enough, meant that this was a complex battle, but it was a modern battle. And the one thing about the First World War, all through it, is that it was a 20th century war fought with 20th century up-to-date weaponry, often not always with 20th century tactics, although by 1918 that changed, but it was always hampered in that it didn't have 20th century communications. There was no proper radio communications to enable men to relay messages in the way that you could in the bocage of Normandy or in the jungles of Burma or whatever. So, part of the way of the army working together was to come around that and work through it. And signals was a massive part of the success of this. The ability to train men to lay ground signals for aircraft to show where you were, to use land-based signals, whether that was semaphore from flags or lamps, so you're morsing a message back, or runners, as we've seen with the film 1917 recently, the importance of runners on a battlefield. And all of this came together so that the army worked like the best orchestra, with every part of it playing its part and achieving what it was set out to achieve. And that ability to to make that coherent and bring it together to fight and win a victory like Amiens was something that took 4 years of war to achieve.
Yeah, it was a key point you brought up. I was actually going to bring it up. It's from 2 years previous on the Somme to you see the Battle of Amiens in 1918. It's just amazing how the tactics had changed from the war of attrition in 1916 to the let's push the German army out and let's push for victory and get everything working, planes, tanks, infantry, all working as one unit, and making the engine sort of fire and the pistons fire all at once. It's amazing that you read that it took 2 years of hard fighting and lessons learnt to then for Amiens to be such a success.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's a famous photograph taken during the Battle of Amiens of the platoon of Sergeant O'Brien of, I think, the 24th Battalion, something like that. And it's a classic image. It's a row of guys with the officer standing in front of them looking at them. Now, if you look at that photograph and you compare it with some famous pictures of diggers coming out of the line at Pozieres along Casualty Corner or somewhere like that, you look at those 1916 pictures and you can't necessarily see who are the specialists within that platoon or company. But you look at this picture of Sergeant O'Brien's mob in 1918 and you can see the Lewis gunners, you can see the rifle grenade men and so on. And again, even at that level, the infantry squad and the infantry platoon and the infantry company has moved forward massively. And the things that they did in 1918 are not at all dissimilar to the way that I would guess modern Australian soldiers are taught to fight battles, in the same way that modern British soldiers are taught to fight these battles. So it was a modern war in every respect.
Absolutely. So often you hear, Paul, that especially in Australian society, that Australia was we won the war, and if it wasn't for the Australians, the British didn't have a choice. They didn't have a chance. And I, after doing research, I don't believe that myself. I look at it and I put it in perspective that we were part of the overall Allied victory. That's my opinion, that we helped, as all the nations who fought in the First World War, we were all part of the Allied victory. But do you, in your opinion, the Anzacs and the Canadians, they were used as crack troops. Why were they different to other fighting forces on the Western Front?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's often referred to as Anzacery, isn't it? This whole concept of the Anzacs. And if you talk to a Canadian audience, the Canadian Expeditionary Force, the Canucks, winning the war, the truth is, no one nation could possibly win a war of this scale, and Britain could not have fought the war from the very beginning without the empire, without nations like Australia and Canada and New Zealand, South Africa, and every other part of the empire that eventually contributed to this. You know, I mentioned coalition warfare before. That didn't have that name at the time, but that's what it was. What you see with countries like Australia and Canada, they're new countries. They're young, self-governing nations, and they have a pride in that, and they're desperate to show what they can do on the world stage. And this is their stage to do that. This is their opportunity to do that. And Gallipoli became that defining moment for Australia, but really its finest moment in that part of the 20th century was what it achieved on the Western Front. From a practical point of view, in 1918, one of the reasons that you see both Australian and Canadian divisions and the whole corps being used continuously is that they were bigger than the equivalent British formations at that time. So the Australians had kept 12 battalions in every infantry division, and the Canadians had done the same. Britain, because of the stranglehold by the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, of the resupply of reinforcements to the Western Front during the winter of 1917-18, because of the terrible losses sustained at Passchendaele, and Lloyd George, being a politician rather than a military commander, was afraid of another Passchendaele, he cut off the supply of reinforcements, and it meant that in the British Army, they reduced the division from 12 battalions down to 9. which is quite a significant loss of fighting strength. So when it came to the spearhead of the final offensives from Amiens through to the end of the war, the Australian Corps and the Canadian Corps pretty much found themselves at the tip of that spear because of this. The Canadians carried on from the 8th of August and fought pretty much non-stop right up until the 11th of November. The last British and Commonwealth soldier to die was a Canadian 2 minutes before the armistice came into effect. The Australians, as you know, stopped at Montbriand with the attack at Montbriand in October, and they didn't fight really in that final month of the war, apart from the odd isolated unit. And the difference was conscription. Is that in Canada there was conscription and a regular flow of reinforcements. I think the Canadians were losing 25,000 men a month on the Western Front.
Wow.
I mean, staggering numbers. And then they were getting enough men to replace them. The Australian Corps, I would guess, are probably suffering very similar casualties in August and in September of 1918. But with the two referendums about conscription rejecting it, it meant that the AIF basically ran out of men by the autumn of 1918. And, you know, there were the jack-ups where units didn't like being disbanded, and Pompey Elliott had to come in to talk to these guys. But the whole structure of the AIF began to collapse, really, as a consequence of this. And this is nothing to do with the bravery and ability of these men or their commanders. It was a practical thing. You can't fight a battle without men, in the same way you can't fight without bullets or bombs or supplies. So both of those nations achieved, really, I think, more than any other period of the war, that reputation as crack troops, as breakthrough troops in those last 100 days. Both paid the price for it, and Australia really paid the biggest price in that it wore them down to nothing by the autumn and made them combat ineffective. And that just reflects the sheer scale of their commitment and their involvement in these decisive battles that broke trench warfare on the Western Front. Because Montbriand was the last battle of trench warfare. The last 4 weeks of the war was much more like Normandy. It was open warfare across fields and in copses and villages and so on. Whereas, you know, that slog from Amiens to the Beaurevoir-Fonsomme line, which Montbriand is very close to, that was the end of trench warfare. And the Australians and the Canadians were at the forefront of that.
So, Paul, what was the Germans' opinion of the Australian and Canadian troops as opposed to some of the other Allied troops? And were they more feared or were they respected?
I'm not sure that they were necessarily more feared. I think there was a belief that certain nations took less prisoners. And certainly on the 8th of August, I mean, there was a phenomenal number of prisoners taken by the AIF on the 8th of August. It's almost 8,000 men. The Canadians, actually, that day, their corps commander, Arthur Currie, he named the operation on the 8th of August Operation Llandovery Castle. And the Llandovery Castle was a hospital ship that had been sunk by a German submarine. And it had Canadian nurses on board who had survived the sinking and were in a lifeboat when the submarine popped up and machine gunned the lifeboat, and the nurses were killed, which this was cited as a war crime. And essentially, it was what we now describe as unrestricted submarine warfare. But he used that example and that name as a message to his troops: don't take prisoners. And if you look at, certainly in the forward area of the battlefield for the Canadian Corps, they take proportionally less prisoners than they would normally do. So there was a fear, I think, from the Germans, you know, with Australians, Canadians, and indeed New Zealanders, that these men were tough troops, different perhaps to the British in many respects, who had years of war behind them, but they were respected. I'm not sure fear is the right word, but they were certainly respected. You know, we've got, I think somewhere there is a list of divisions that the Germans rated, and both Australian and Canadian units are within that, but a number of other British units are as well. And I think you've got to be careful of sort of banging a nationalistic drum there, but I think that, you know, at the end of the day, if you look at the results of what both those corps, both the Australian and Canadian Corps, achieved in 1918, it is quite incredible. You know, to fight that many days and fight that many German formations over that period, it is a part of our history that really should be recognised more for what it is, a great victory, a costly victory, but a great victory.
In your opinion, Paul, why was August the 8th so successful? And was it due to the strategical planning or the stealth of the troops leading up to the battle? Why, in your opinion, was it so successful?
Well, I think it's a mix of all those things. You know, as we've mentioned before, it was a modern battle, and they used things in different ways. So, I mean, aircraft were used to resupply and bomb and strafe, but in the approach to the 0 hour on the 8th of August, they had hundreds of aircraft in the sky over the battlefield to drown out the noise of over 500 tanks that were approaching the front line to take part in this assault. So it's detail like that. You know, when we look at D-Day in the Second World War, the amount of planning and detailed planning that went into that is phenomenal, and that's what helped achieve victory. We don't always see that with First World War battles, but by 1918, you know, that is Amiens is a really good example of that type of operation where they've planned things right down to, you know, really fine detail, and also that you're not, again, going back to 2 years to Pozières. I would guess that most diggers who went into action there, particularly in the early battles of July and August, only had the sort of faintest idea of where some of that was or where the German positions were, and had possibly never seen a map of it, and possibly even some of the officers did not have decent maps of where the German positions were. But by 1918, you know, everybody down to platoon level has got maps. NCOs, non-commissioned officers, have maps. Sometimes these little message maps, which are small things that they can stuff in their pocket, which has got their area of operations in, and often they have a few of them, and there's a space on the back. So if you get to a point and you've captured your objective, you can mark where you are on the map, write a message on the back of it, fold it up, give it to a runner, and then send it off back to the nearest relay point and get that information sent back. So it's the whole approach to the way the war was fought, the utilisation of the weapons that they had, and bringing men on board. You know, and the Australians are particularly good at this. If you look at Monash, if you go back to the attack at Le Hamel, which sort of set the path for this, the Australians, as you know, at Bullecourt had a very bad experience with tanks, and the tanks let part of their assault down, and the tankers, you know, paid a hefty price going forward into that assault, and it probably, in the minds of the ordinary Australian soldier, it made them mistrust tanks. So Monash got units that took part in Le Hamel, took them out of the line to the tank corps training areas, and he got them to climb all over the tanks, climb inside the tanks. The tanks ran around like doing joy rides with diggers on the top, and the idea was to sort of foster this relationship between the guys who operated the tanks, to demonstrate that the tanks had moved on since Bullecourt, that these were, you know, modern weapons. Really, they still had their limitations compared to modern tanks, but at the time this was cutting edge technology. We can't ever forget that, really. But it inculcated this idea in the mind of the ordinary Australian soldier that he could rely on this weapon, and that the war had changed. And I think that doing things like that changes the way, the outcome of battles, because men feel invested in it and they feel a part of it. They're not just pawns being moved forward. You know, a good commander takes his men into a battle with a fairly good chance of them coming out. He doesn't, you know, a good commander does not take men into a situation where they're all going to die. And I think that there was more of a feeling of that in 1918, that this was something different, bigger than them, that they were a part of, but they were going to play their role, and their role was important, perhaps in a way that it might not always have seemed.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that, and it's a key point that you make that in 1918, a soldier could see that a victory was near, as in 1916, a soldier wouldn't see that there was a victory, that it would be a continuation of hard fought slog and more, and obviously that if they went into the front line in 1916, there was more of a chance. Well, there was a chance in 1918 as well, but there was more of a chance that they wouldn't come out of a battle, as in 1918 there was a lot more of a chance that they would come out of a battle.
Yeah, yeah, and I think as well, the moving forward of medical arrangements, and some years ago, I did a story for a TV program where we looked at the Australians and the attack on the 8th of August, and looked at the medical arrangements of them coming back. It was very sophisticated, and it mirrored not just what the Australians were doing, but what everybody within the British Expeditionary Force, British, Canadians, New Zealanders were doing. That men had a much better chance of surviving a battlefield wound in 1918 than they had done 2 years before. The ability to just treat them, but also patch up wounds on the battlefield. Many men died. There's plenty of cemeteries around Amiens that were close to the casualty clearing stations where soldiers have died of their wounds without antibiotics to treat infected wounds. That there was always going to be a greater number of men dying of that, but significantly I think more lives were saved in that period. And I think that if a soldier believes that he's going to go into battle with a pretty good chance of victory, that he is playing an important role in this, so he feels motivated, and that if he is hit and not killed and he's wounded, that he's got a good chance of getting off that battlefield and surviving. This is how you win wars. You compare that to the Germans, who possibly thought something very different, then I think that's possibly why you're beginning to see the collapse of the German army.
Absolutely. I'd agree with that 100%. So, what were the casualties of Amiens, Paul? What were the figures of casualties, killed, taken prisoner, or wounded?
Incredibly, there was only on the first day there was only a couple of thousand casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. And I think the Australians took just over 7,000 casualties. The Canadians took 7,000 prisoners. The Canadians took about 6,000, and the French about 3,500. It's a significant number of prisoners. And a significantly small casualty figure really for the advance. And if you think that they were advancing, a dozen or so kilometres into the German positions, if you look at that battlefield from the start line near Le Hamel and Villers-Bretonneux, and the Amiens-Saint-Quentin road across towards just south of the River Somme around Harbonnières and places like that. If you look at the total area of that ground, it's about probably nearly 10 times as big as the ground around Pozières. And that was 2 months of fighting in 1916, and this is one day. So it's a significant area of ground for minimal losses. Every loss, every casualty is a tragedy. But for the scale of that, it's quite incredible. And the huge number of German prisoners indicates, how these units were A, collapsing, and B, caught unawares by the bombardment. Because one of the things that comes out of Le Hamel is this idea and this tactic to advance right up to the artillery bombardment, right up to the barrage, so that the Germans are pummeled in their dugouts and are not going to come out, because if they do, they're going to get hit by artillery fire. And previously, they know that when that barrage lifts, there is a degree of time between the barrage lifting and the arrival of the Tommies, whether they're British, Australian, Canadian, whatever. And the Germans call all British troops, all British and Commonwealth troops, der Tommies. You actually see it in German documents. So they know there's going to be this gap. But in 1918, Monash perfected this system where you wouldn't have a gap. So when the barrage lifted, actually you've got a platoon of infantry standing at the dugout entrances. The Jerrys come up, and rather than set up their weapons, they're popping their hands up saying "camarade," and the war for them is over. So I think that there's a mixture of that, where particularly in the forward zone of the battlefield, a lot of men are captured quite early on because the bombardment has done its job and the integration of these tactics works well. But then once they see line after line of defence, which were nothing. I mean, if you look at the OG lines around Pozieres, that's a substantial system of defences. There was nothing like that around Villers-Bretonneux and along the Amiens-Saint-Quentin road. These were outpost lines. And when you go and visit the trenches in the Australian Corps Memorial Park at La Hamel, and people look at them and they're shallow ditches, and they say, oh, you know, they collapsed. And like, no, actually, they're pretty much what they look like in 1918. You know, trenches had changed. They weren't permanent positions anymore. They were fighting positions that you moved from to either push an enemy back or to advance yourself. So I think that, you know, the Germans didn't have the ability to hold off an advance of this scale with the sort of in-depth positions that they'd once had, because this was all ground that until the spring of 1918 had been behind the Allied lines for most of the war. The defences just weren't there. I mean, there were trenches, but it was nothing like the OG line or nothing like the positions on the first day of the Battle of the Somme that the British advanced against. So it reflected the change in the type of warfare.
Oh, absolutely. So, in your opinion, Paul, what's your view of General Monash, and does he deserve the credit that is given to him for Battle of Amiens?
Well, I mean, as the newly appointed Corps Commander of the Australian Corps, I'm sure that in his first battle he'd want to be seen as the architect of it. Yeah, he was and he wasn't. I mean, he wasn't his single-handed plan. It was a plan that was developed by the Generalissimo, the Commander-in-Chief, Marshal Foch, in conjunction with Sir Douglas Haig, and then passed down to the Army Commander Rawlinson, who then consulted his Corps commanders. And Arthur Currie, commanding the Canadians, played as much of a role in it as Monash did. But I think the difference with Monash is that he, unlike the Canadians, who had been very heavily involved in stemming some of the advance in the spring, although the Australians had done that, the bringing together of the Australians into that corps had given, and the situation at La Hamel, that rather fluid position around Corby, south of the Somme, and the whole peaceful penetration period of the war, gave the Australian Corps an opportunity to put a lot of ideas into practice. And La Hamel absolutely clearly paved the way for a lot of the things that were done on the 8th of August. And credit to that goes to Monash, there's no doubt about that. But, you know, as I said earlier, he was one of a lot of corps commanders, and then beneath them divisional commanders, who had developed different ways of fighting as the war had gone on. And that men who'd commanded brigades or divisions on the Somme were now divisional or corps commanders in 1918, and had brought with them the experience and the lessons learned from that. And that was true in British formations, as well as Australian, Canadian, New Zealand, and so on. So, you know, it's not down to one man. He played a absolutely crucial role in it. And he was one of the architects of victory, not just on the 8th of August, but in that final phase of the war, but not the only one. But in terms of, you know, Australian military history, he is one of Australia's greatest generals, and a man that should be, you know, as I'm sure he is, revered and celebrated and remembered.
Oh, I'd agree with that assessment of him, and I think a lot of people too, Paul, that in Australia they say, you know, oh, he won the war and he was the greatest general, and then you get a lot of backlash for Sir Douglas Haig. And I often, and through my research, and I'm, well, in my opinion, I think the criticism to Haig is not justified. I think and people have got to remember too that being a corps commander to being a field marshal, which Sir Douglas Haig was, they're two different jobs, and what people have got to remember too is that General Haig was in charge of 5 armies. It's a whole nother level from being a corps commander, and Monash was great at what he did, but I feel that Haig gets an unjustified criticism, and do you agree in what I've said?
Yeah, absolutely. It's, you know, he was the manager of the whole expeditionary force, which included every British and Commonwealth nation within it. So he was commanding men from many, many nations, from many, many backgrounds, from many, many abilities, and many religions as well, and everything that was involved in that. And as the war went on, he remained in his post, not through luck or chance, but because, going back to what we were saying earlier, command at that level is management, and as a manager, it's your job to appoint the right people to lead your men on the battlefield, and in turn, those men need to do it, and they need to fight successfully. And you're quite right when you say that some men at one level were good, but if promoted to another, they were not so good. General Snow in the British Army is a good example of this. He'd been a divisional commander at the beginning of the war, and he fought a successful battle at Le Cateau in 1914. He was the only senior officer to have trained his men to withdraw under the fire of the enemy before the war. It's considered the British Army doesn't withdraw, don't train men to do this, but actually at Le Cateau this played dividends. And he was right amidst the battle there. His headquarters was within sight of where the fluid front lines were. At the Second Battle of Ypres, he commanded another division, and they fought a good defensive battle in the gas attack. But when he was promoted to a corps commander, it was just beyond his ability. And on the first day of the Battle of the Somme at Gommecourt, 2 of his divisions were annihilated in a diversionary attack there, and he ended up blaming his own men for the failure. There was a court of inquiry. So, that's a good example of a man doing well at one level and then not doing so well at another one. And people often say, who would have replaced Haig? Well, it wouldn't have been Monash, because Monash was quite some way down the scale anyway, as was Arthur Currie with the Canadians and so on. They were corps commanders. You got 5 armies in the British Army, so it would have been one of them army commanders. Possibly Byng, who'd commanded the Canadian Corps at Vimy, he was now an army commander. Who knows? But I don't think any of them would have been that keen on having the job. They were good army commanders. In 1918, they demonstrated they were good army commanders. And Haig was there as the top man. He wasn't, as we see in Blackadder, pushing models of soldiers around a map.
No, that's very, very true. And I think too, Paul, that I think under the circumstances, we've got to see that Haig did the best. He did the best job he could with what the resources he had at the time. I think that's how you've got to perceive Haig and take away the job that he did. And to be honest, I think he did an amazing job. I really do.
Yeah, I mean, it was an unprecedented war. That no one had fought a war which was a siege war, really, of this scale ever, over such a protracted period. That they went from this development of the British Army was ahead of its time in 1914 compared to other European wars, but it was tiny, absolutely tiny, going from this small amount of men in 1982. I mean, Haig, we must never forget, he commanded the biggest British army in the history of Great Britain. No British army's ever been bigger before or since. So it was a massive task. And he was not a charismatic general in the same way that Montgomery was in the Second World War. But he was a man who was stoical and would see it to the end. He was determined, and he knew how to promote the right people. And he knew how to promote the right ideas. He's often, you see these accounts of chastising him for not rating the machine gun and the tank, when actually, when you look at it, under him, development of the machine gun corps took place, and the whole development of tanks from heavy branch through to tank corps. Tanks could have, after Passchendaele, when tanks bogged in the mud, they could have been sidelined. Many commanders didn't like them. The Australians, as we said, at Bullecourt weren't too keen on them after that experience. But Haig enabled the tanks to have this battle to prove what they could do at Cambrai in 1917 over ground. It was in the autumn, but ground not dissimilar to that Amiens, good favourable tank country. And that turned the whole fortunes of the tanks and their role on the battlefield around, and again, without tanks, there's over 550 of them in the Battle of Amiens. There's no way that we would have achieved victory on that sort of scale, because they were an important part of the battlefield arsenal by 1918.
No, that's right, and I think too we should also pay credit to Ferdinand Foch and Haig, because a lot of people, as you said earlier on in the podcast, a lot of people thought the war would continue on into 1919 and beyond. And it was because of the Battle of Amiens and other victories that Foch and Haig said, well, no, we can win the war, but we've got to give it absolutely everything. We've no matter the cost, no matter the how many men we lose, we have a chance to win this war at the end of 1918, and we have to push as hard as we can. So I really think that the Battle of Amiens is a real, like you said, is a real turning point to winning the war.
Absolutely. And I think that, over the period of a century or more now, I think that the jeopardy of Imperial Germany has been lost. If you said to somebody, was it worth fighting the Nazis or not? I mean, no one's seriously going to say, oh no, we should have just let them be. And Imperial Germany was not Nazi Germany, but it threatened the British and Empire way of life. And Britain, in 1914 had stayed out of European conflict for 99 years, when perhaps it shouldn't have done. I mean, in the 1860s, Prussia fought several wars of aggression against countries like Austria and Denmark, particularly with Denmark, because of the connection between Denmark and Britain. They wanted Britain to be involved and fight along their side, and that didn't happen, and Denmark was overrun by the Prussians, and Schleswig-Holstein was taken and all that sort of stuff. Britain had not been involved in these conflicts when perhaps it should have done. So there are so many what ifs in history. We can go over them again and again, and the reality is that by 1918 it was a different war. The right people were in the right places. Germany was on its knees, and we had the ability to fight a proper modern war and win it. And Amiens is the first expression of that.
Absolutely. I agree. I think, and basically it's a way of showing how a modern battle today was fought. You would from the studies you would say this is how a modern battle should be fought.
Absolutely. And a lot of German commanders who achieved high command and victory in 1940, 80 years ago. When you read their memoirs, they say that they got a lot from studying that battle. That really, that day was for them the architect of what we now call Blitzkrieg, this lightning war, because it was the combination of infantry with tanks, aircraft in the sky, and guns behind them that enabled victory. And you see exactly that sort of thing being put into practice by the German army in 1939 and 40, and indeed beyond with the invasion of Russia. But it's just that the British forgot about it for the next 20 odd years. We just sort of we convinced ourselves that we'd fought the war to end all wars, that we didn't need an army, and we sidelined it, and everything that had been achieved and all the advances that had been made were sort of lost along the way. I mean, we mentioned Ivan Maxey earlier. He became the chief training officer of the British Army, and he kept live fire exercises going on beyond the armistice. When he retired, that ceased. And that meant in 1939, when Britain went to war again with another BEF, the second BEF, most of those men had never undergone live fire exercises, and perhaps none of them had. Not in the same way that the soldiers in the First World War had. So, and that was a massive. That was a part of the reason for the outcome of some of the battles in 1940. So, it's a key period, not just in Great War history, but in 20th century history.
Absolutely. So, Paul, just to wrap it up, what projects are you currently working on?
Well, I'm doing my weekly podcast, wandering around the battlefields of the Great War, which is quite good in this time of lockdown. Not been able to get there. It's been quite nice to close my eyes and reimagine myself at Pozières or Ypres or wherever it is. So that's been good. I'm working on a new guidebook to the Forgotten Front, which is the battlefields between Armentières and Lens in northern France, where a lot of 1915 battles took place, but also Fromelles in 1916. There'll be a chapter on Fromelles in that book. And then we're just waiting for the world to reopen again, and hopefully get back to doing a few battlefield tours and some more TV stuff along the line. Although it's getting harder and harder to persuade TV channels to make documentaries about the First World War, or indeed the Second World War these days. But we keep trying. You know, we're coming up to centenary of the Unknown Warrior, and it would have been quite nice to have had something about, you know, that and the whole concept of loss from the First World War and remembrance, which would have tied in nicely. But we shall see.
Yeah, no, I still think that, Paul, we need these forgotten chapters. They need to be told still. There's so many stories, and I've listened to your podcast, and just some of the stories that you speaking to great war veterans, and just I feel the same with the Second World War veterans. Their stories, they need to be told. We need to know the history. If you don't know the history, how can you move forward?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And these are, you know, when you look at what those generations went through, you know, it's part of our past, but I think all of it, in many respects, signals our future as well. In that we have a lot to learn from these people that they went through. You know, we've just been through some very trying periods. And I look back on my grandmother's experiences of the home front in the Second World War, and the things that she learned, and things that she taught me have paid dividends during this time of always making sure that I've got a few tins in the cupboard and, you know, cooking and things like that. It's just,
Yep.
You know, the past is not just a foreign country. It is a place in which we can visit and learn, and it's not just about remembering past events. It's about what they can teach us about our own present day and indeed our future.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, it's been great to have you on, and we'll definitely get you back on podcast again to definitely speak about some more great memories of World War One and obviously World War Two. So I do appreciate you giving your time and telling us a little bit about the Battle of Amiens. And Paul Reid, thank you very much, and we'll have you back on again soon.
My absolute pleasure, Adam. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast.